So all those stories right ahead. I'm James Chow in our main studios here in Beijing. It's 12 lunchtime here. It's 5 a.m. over in Copenhagen, where day one has come to an end at the biggest and most important UN conference on climate change. As Zheng Siwei reports, there's an unmistakable sense of unity and political determination hanging in the air.
Optimism, that is the overall impression that first comes to mind as the UN's top climate expert and conference president contemplates the first round of talks in Copenhagen.
I have never seen anything like it when it comes to political will. And I also take it that the political will never be bigger. Pressure on everybody to try to
110
deliver.
heads of state or government have said they will attend the end of the conference in 2 weeks' time.
I believe that this conference has already written history, that this conference will write history, but we need to make sure that it writes the right history.
The 2-week conference convened in an upbeat mood after a series of promises by rich and emerging economies to curb their greenhouse gas emissions. The US has pledged to cut emissions about 17% by 2020. China has vowed to curb the intensity of its carbon emissions by 40 to 45% per unit of GDP by 2020. India has said it is likewise prepared to cut emissions intensity 20 to 25% by 2020. Russia's goal is a 40% improvement in energy efficiency by 2020, but the country is willing to reduce emissions between 20 and 25% from 1990 levels. The 27-member EU aims to take action that will limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. The bloc says it will cut carbon dioxide emissions 20% by 2020 from 1990 levels.
And if you look at the announcement that was made by China alone, that accounts for about 25% of the emission reductions that we need to see in order to avoid more than a 2-degree temperature increase. So very significant commitments are being made by developing countries.
Still, major issues have yet to be resolved. At stake is a deal that aims to wean the world away from fossil fuels and other pollutants to greener sources of energy and to transfer hundreds of billions of dollars from rich to poor countries every year over decades to help them adapt to climate change. The first week of the conference will focus on refining the complex text of a draft treaty, but major decisions will await the arrival of environment ministers and heads of state in the final days of the conference. Zheng Siwei, CCTV.
Staying with that, a couple of quick stories. Now, at the climate conference, the group of 77 plus China have criticized industrialized nations for attempts to shift the burden of addressing the adverse impacts of climate change onto developing nations. Now, those developing nations have also rejected the goal of their developed counterparts to conclude a legally binding instrument that would combine the obligations of developed countries under the Kyoto Protocol with commensurate measures by developing countries. Meanwhile, a climate campaigner from Fiji has made an appeal for the talks to save her island nation from rising seas.
We need a deal that is fair to the poorest people and nations that have had little or nothing to do with the issue, but that will be affected the most. We need a deal that secures a safe planet for all peoples and nations. We need a deal that is fair, ambitious, and legally binding.
Well, China can't be expected to cut emissions more than it already has, as according to Xie Zhenhua, Vice Minister of the National Development and Reform Commission. The top Chinese official arrived in the Danish capital Monday to attend that UN climate conference. Xie said China's commitment to reducing the intensity of its carbon dioxide emissions by 2020 amply demonstrates that the country is a responsible international stakeholder. He argued that it would be unreasonable to demand further emission cuts from China given its developing nation status and also substantive unilateral initiatives. Xie Zhenhua notes that developed countries which shoulder the historic burden for climate change have have completed their industrialization. China, on the other hand, is at a critical juncture in its industrialization and urbanization process. Over the past 5 years, China has made every conceivable effort to cut emissions, wiping out more than 1.5 billion tons of carbon of discharge. It would therefore be difficult to justify demands that a developing nation like China cut emissions even further at the expense of both its economy and its development.
As far as I can see, not one country has been able to cut as much carbon during its industrialization period as China has. It is unreasonable to demand even more. It is not practical and not based on sound scientific principles.